the rise of the so-called Web 2.0 platform economy, social media or social networking sites, a particular paradigm of the online self has been established as the new default. I think of this as the persistent personal identity configuration of the online self, where the term configuration highlights the fact that it is merely one among many possible configurations. And as a model, it interpolates the individual as a personal user and imagines the social as the interactions between such networked individuals. Facebook is the platform that has most consistently and radically implemented this model. Within the sanitized and gated community of known friends, all content is organized in personal timelines and aggregated into algorithmically customized news feeds. So the fact that this configuration has become dominant is of course contingent on certain underlying structural determinants. Persistent personal identity as a social and cultural form is most readily compatible with the economic imperatives of data capitalism, as well as with the biopolitical imperatives of governments. However, there are still certain digital realms where this model of online interaction and identity fails to take root and is even actively defied or simply ignored. I'm thinking of the anonymous Imageboard communities of sites like 4chan, where Anonymous ultimately originated. So, and this will be the topic of my presentation, what kind of alternative online selves are constructed and performed there, and to what extent are they incommensurable with or even antagonistic to the idea of persistent personal identity that social media culture projects. And I would like to show that these image boards gave birth to and provided a home to a certain configuration of the online self that I call an impersonal one. To do so, I will focus on two images I encountered during my research into this image board culture, which I think are exemplary of the politics and aesthetics of the impersonal self, understood as a kind of ludic departure from the personal as propagated by social media giants like Facebook, etc. Now, these are the two images I would like to discuss today. The first is so-called stock avatar or generic profile picture, which I understand as signifying a form of anyone-subjectivity, which I hope to explain a little bit later on. The second depicts a naked and rather obese man behind a computer, of whom it is asserted that he is responsible singly for 87% of all posts written on 4chan. So, taking this joke on its word, the idea that the total creation and circulation of images and text on 4chan can be attributed to one single perversely godlike user, I analyzed this last image in terms of the grotesque media body. The grotesque body being a concept developed by Mikhail Bakhtin in his work on pre-modern popular culture and the carnivalesque in the works of Rabelais. Can you go to... But before turning to the more detailed analysis of these images, just very schematically a bit of historical context, and of course really oversimplifying and reducing the complexities of the history of the internet. But basically there has been a structural transformation of the internet from a space that was open to forms of ludic and anonymous or pseudonymous identity play, or what I call anon or mass culture, to persistent personal identity regimes, or what I call face culture. And in Facebook, the personalized user profiles, filtered timelines, and social graphs cause the withering of anonymity not only in a technological sense, which is relevant to debates on privacy, surveillance, etc., because it tracks and accumulates and sells personal data, but also precisely on the level of shifting paradigms of online sociality and culture. The fact that user registration has become default, real name verification required, and content organized into a personal timeline format. And then on the other hand, 4chan remains one of the central sites to cultivate a festive and mock affirmative relation to anonymity as an anti and impersonal mode of media presumption that is collective, ephemeral, authorless, and in that sense nameless and faceless. And its most popular B-board, B-random board, allows anyone to post nearly anything without registration and without hardly any moderation, nor does it maintain a record of past threads. And I encountered one description of 4chan that I particularly liked, and that reads, think of 4chan as a big roll of butcher paper on a conveyor belt that users scroll things on as fast as they can before it goes into an incinerator. Can you go? So going back still a little bit further, not into the actual history of the internet, but in the underlying vision that I think animates and sustains it. And this, I would say, is the ideology of authentic and expressive individuality as something that both the personal computer and the internet, to a large extent, derive their cultural and social legitimacy from. The idea that these new technologies liberate and give unique voice to forms of expression that treat the individual in his or her unique personality. And this in contrast, so the story goes, to the mass media technologies of a uniform, standardized industrial society, which breeding alienation, passivity, and conformity is premised on the suppression of authentic and rebellious individuality. So in the case of the Apple commercial from 1984, which ironically comments on 1984, the work, we see these rows of zombie-like factory workers whose gender cannot be clearly identified, let alone any uniquely personal features distinguished, and all wear the same blue-gray prisoner suits until, of course, in their midst a brightly colored, modern, rebellious girl appears who breaks the totalitarian spell. So turning to the first image. We're all familiar with the stock avatar or generic profile picture. Those standard images that function as placeholders for an absent, ideally soon to be added profile picture. What kind of online self does the stock photo that precedes, holds the place of, yet also replaces the personal portrait project? And to what potential use and form of the self that remains virtual in it does it direct us? These generic stock avatars, I would say, invoke a certain impersonal, anonymous presence. At issue is a curious subtraction. Identity is announced, anticipated, yet absent. So, yet there is still something there, a potential indefinite presence. The open, undecided position of enunciation from which a common yet unknown speech may suddenly come forth. One that is irreducible to and in excess of the uniquely personal. Instead, it points to what is interchangeable, shared by and connected to anyone, or singular plural. That element in an act or thought that could be anyone's, yet by that fact belongs to no one. And part of the dictionary definition of impersonal is the grammatical sense of denoting the verbal action of an unspecified agent and hence used with no expressed subject. In this respect, the stock avatar haunts the personalized, networked individualism that social media platforms promote, as it's necessary but irreconcilable before that ever threatens to replace it or put it in its place as one among many possible iterations of digital subjectivity. Haunt because when suppressed, it inevitably returns the actual to its status as one among many, to the possible from which it has temporarily managed to wrest itself. It is here that the category of the anyone or anyone self, as theorized in the phenomenological tradition, becomes relevant, starting with Heidegger, taken up by Blanchot, and more recently by Deleuze and others. So, for Heidegger, the question of the diffuse and indefinite status of Dasein, as it is always already thrown into the public world of undefined others, arises within the problematic of the day, das Man, or the anonymous anyone self, as the who of Dasein in its banal everyday existence, from which, according to Heidegger at least, it must ultimately rest itself towards a truly authentic mode of existence. In the everyday, Heidegger states, one speaks. This diffuse being of the day, which is neither individual nor collective, he observes is both everywhere and nowhere, and in it everyone is the other and no one is himself. So the who of the day is not this one and not that one, not oneself, not some and not the sum of them all, he says, somewhat or cryptically. So building upon the phenomenology of the day as laid out by Heidegger, but taking a much less pejorative, sympathetic disposition to the realm of the everyday, Blanchot writes in an essay called Everyday Speech that the everyday is indeed without a subject. He says, when I live the everyday, it's any man, anyone at all who does so. And this anyone, properly speaking, is neither me nor properly the other. He is neither the one nor the other. And in their interchangeable presence, there annulled irreciprocity, both the one and the other. So in this realm, he suggests, there exists neither strong I-Thou, I-You relations, nor a sense of we-ness. We are rather in the sphere of what Sartre called seriality, exemplified by the busy city streets in which everything without discretion interpenetrates in an impure mix. Blanchot again, the everyday is the movement by which man, as though without knowing it, holds himself back in human anonymity. In the everyday, we have no name, little personal reality, scarcely a figure, just as we have no social determination to sustain or enclose us. So in this image, this form of the stock avatar is appropriated within Imageboard culture. And I think it also captures in this context, the avatar captures the dimension of global anyone-ness that is neither collective we nor an individual I, but an elusive third or even fourth person plural they or one. So in Anonymous and the larger subculture of image boards like 4chan, the generic or faceless face was appropriated to reflect Anon's mock affirmative cultivation of itself as an impersonal monstrous swarm, a hate machine, a carnivalesque self-representation as encompassing everyone and anyone. And what emerges from this culture is a figure called Anon, of which no portrait is yet found. And if he had a portrait, or she, it would perhaps look something like this, a generic portrait of no one in particular, yet neither invisible or unable to speak. Anon is indeed anyone insofar as she engages in the anonymous and impersonal modes of sociality and media presumption that the internet enables. And as such, it constitutes a kind of counter-performance to the individualized enactment of the online self in social media culture. Okay, so, yes, thank you. Turning to the second image, because part of the idea of the stock avatar and of Anonymous as an idea is that, as someone observed, 4chan can read like a schizophrenic soliloquy where a single user named Anonymous carries on multiple conversations with himself. And this idea is also present in the current image. So again, it says 87% of the posts are written by this man. So it depicts a giant self-conversation by one single entity, which in my analysis represents a typical instance of what Bakhtin calls a praise and abuse image, a carnivalesque trope in which abusive words are used in an affectionate sense. So it both mocks and celebrates 4chan as this overflowing body which is too large to contain itself, beyond all proper form, healthy insofar as it is unhealthy, social insofar as it is asocial, according to the mainstream norms. So the grotesque media body presented here acts as a kind of affirmative, although ambivalent representation of the impersonal cacophony of voices that is 4chan. And as such, the naked and obese body renders tangible the process of collective media production and consumption as the techno-social equivalent of a giant digestive tract, consuming each user as part of a larger mass body of threads without beginning or end, in which the empty space between users and their individual personalities is temporarily suspended. That is, the empty space between individual nodes, which allows the network metaphor to function, is quite literally imploded into the flesh, into the opaque bowel movements of a single man. And we can imagine someone like Habermas would certainly not approve of this rendition of the internet as a public sphere. Because for Bakhtin, instead, the grotesque body is always related to its other, which is the official classical body, as its ludic and coarse subversion. And typically the head and the face, in their historically uneasy relationship to the materiality of the body and its gravitational pull, belong to the aesthetic repertoire of the classical body, the portrait. A window to the soul, the face, all eyes, asserts itself as beyond and above materiality, just as the person defines himself in his uniqueness to the mass of indefinite others. So in contrast to the grotesque body, which is subject to a continuous process of degeneration and regeneration, metamorphosis and expansion, the classical body of official culture is closed and finished. It is a surface and as such isolated alone, fenced off from all other bodies. It centers on the individual, strictly limited mass, the impenetrable facade, this is Bakhtin, a closed individuality that does not merge with other bodies and with the world. And it is in this description that we might recognize the persistent personal identity configuration of the online self, which the grotesque media body of 4chan comically inverts and defies. Then, concluding, I've left open the question of the relation between the Anyone-Subjectivity implicit in the stock avatar and the grotesque media body of the depiction of 4chan as one single entity. So for me, these images can be read as kind of collective self-representations in a loosely Durkheimian sense, as symbolic expressions of social relationships that actively feed back into, constitute and reconstitute those social relationships themselves. But a thought as to their relation could be that not having a face, or having a faceless generic face that is anyone's, yet belongs to no one, is a precondition of absorption and participation in the collective festive body of 4chan. So this body can only be constructed out of any bodies that never quite harden or crystallize into definite somebodies. Just as conversely, the conflation and confusion of individual users in a single obese body prefigures the ability to become anyone, to temporarily deliver oneself over to an impersonal existence. And I would like to end with this point that for me it is not so much that these images primarily project an alternative utopian space in the arguably naive and overly romantic hermeneutic of popular culture that Bakhtin uses, but rather that by enacting the often cruelly impersonal, monstrous and banal aspects of mediatic globalization and its discontents, to use a Freudian phrase, it lays bare in a very painful way precisely where the flight into and power of attraction of the personal and the communal comes from, as the negativity that sustains it and which social media platforms so successfully exploit and cater to. Thank you.